Welcome. I hope you enjoyed our introduction to the problem of the cause of the American Civil War. And let me clarify that and explain to you that all historical events are complex. And this lecture is not to be meant to be a reductionist lecture, meaning there's only one cause. However, what I want to do is make an argument today that there was one primary cause, with many other causes that were associated with that primary cause. Historians have debated this problem since the end of the Civil War, and really at the beginning of the Civil War. And a number of different positions have been taken. Of course, most of you are familiar with the fact that historians, some have argued that the Civil War was all about states' rights. At the end of the Civil War, Stephen Douglas, the Vice President of the Confederacy, stated that was what they were fighting for, was states' rights. Historians in the early 20th century tended to take a similar view. However, when the progressive era began, and historians like Charles Baird appeared on the scene, they looked at economic interests. That shouldn't surprise you that Charles Baird wrote something on the coming of the Civil War. And he argued that primarily it was about an inevitable clash between two visions of the United States. One, a dynamic capitalistic vision held in the North and transmitted from the Federalist Party to the Whig Party, and then from there to the Republican Party. And he made the argument, and it's a pretty convincing one, I think, at least from the Northern point of view, that the Republican Party won the election of the presidential election in 1860 because the Republican Party added a plank to its platform calling for higher tariffs, which turned Pennsylvania to the Republican column and ensured Abraham Lincoln's victory in the election. So Baird is arguing that slavery wasn't the primary issue. It was one of the issues, but all of them were in some way or another attached to the interest of economics. And if you have listened to me lecture, despite the fact that I am not an economic determinist, I do believe that much of American history from the time of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson to the Civil War was about two visions of America. Hamilton's vision of America as a dynamic capitalistic society, and Jefferson's vision of America as an idyllic, utopian agrarian republic. And very much, I think both systems are rooted in economic interest. So that may surprise you to hear me say that. But I don't think that's all that's going on here. And I think it's more complicated than that. But what Baird was saying is the Civil War was inevitable. And on that part, I think that's where economic determinism doesn't work. Because first of all, the whole idea that something is inevitable, you can't prove. You can't prove that it's inevitable that something will happen. Because it did happen doesn't mean it had to happen. And it's impossible to prove that. So it's a fallacious historical assertion to say that economic determinism works. And it's flawed in its very fundamental underlying assertion that it's inevitable. So, and other historians came along who really, again, in the 1950s and 1960s, demolished Baird in the sense that they proved that it was not inevitable. This generation of historians were called the blundering generation, not because they blundered, but because their main argument was that the war started because politicians on both sides blundered into it. Different historians blamed different groups. Probably my favorite history of that era was a history by Avery Craven called The Coming of the Civil War. And he argued that the breakup of the second political party system, which really took place in the first few years of the decade of the 1850s, set the stage for the blundering generation to bring the country to the brink and into a civil war, a secessionist crisis first and then a civil war. Craven, who had Southern sympathies, but remember, because someone has a bias doesn't mean that that necessarily refutes their theory. A theory of history, an interpretation of history, stands or falls based on the evidence. Craven argued that the blunderers had names like William Seward and Abraham Lincoln because the new Republican Party was purely a sectional party. The Whig Party and the Democratic Party prior to the 1850s were national parties that worked very hard at keeping the issue of slavery submerged beneath the surface so that it did not rise up and bite the nation and produce a civil war. They recognized the danger of that. But with the demise of the Whig Party and the Democratic Party being the only viable party, Northerners who had formerly been Whigs and some Democrats were concerned about Northern political power, and they needed to latch on to a issue that would unite Northerners behind the banner of their new party, the Republican Party. And they latched on the issue of slavery. And Craven blames the political ambitions of Abraham Lincoln and others for inflaming passions in the South by provoking them through continually bringing up the issue of slavery and primarily focusing on the issue of slavery in the territories. I think that the blundering generation was correct. The historians were correct. I'm not so sure that I agree with Craven, although I like his word. The truth is that they were correct that the Civil War was not inevitable, but that it was a blunder, and that it was a blunder. I think it was an avoidable war. There were certainly opportunities, and the reason that it came had much to do with the failure of people to ultimately find a way to avoid a war and compromise. Now, that being said, more recently, historians have returned to the issue of slavery. In particular, two historians, Eugene Genovese, in his book Political Economy of Slavery, and the 2-volume work by William Freeling, possibly the definitive account of the coming of the Civil War, have argued that the Civil War was ultimately caused because of the South's insistence on protecting the institution of slavery and expanding it into the West. Genovese makes a convincing case in the Political Economy of Slavery that Southerners, that the taproot of the Southern value system and world system was its belief in the positive good of the institution of slavery. Now that may shock us today, but here is a real important point as we talk about the Civil War or about any historical event. History is not a morality play. It is not about attempting to impose our values of right and wrong on the actions and behavior and conduct of people in the past. I hope I have emphasized that in this class. Yes, I think some people in the past were evil. I think Adolf Hitler was evil. Scary thing is Hitler thought he was good and he was doing the right thing. Nonetheless, I think he was evil. And I admit also that I have limits of trying to get in the mind of others, especially if I find their ideas chilling and appalling. Nonetheless, historians have to be, to a degree, dispassionate and try to understand people in their own way of thinking and use that understanding to help them explain how the past unfolded. So Genovese makes the case that in the North and South, the taproot of both systems was their labor system. In the North, the great idea in the North was the idea of free labor, going back to the Puritans. And you might remember my previous lectures, and you will get the point that there is a method in my madness, that from the time that we talked about the Puritans and the Protestant Reformation to now, I have been emphasizing the fact that the North represented the idea of industry and frugality and the honor and dignity of free work. This is the central idea of the Republican Party. I'm not going to spend much time talking about this in this lecture, but as Carl Schurz said, the great idea, and he was a contemporary of Lincoln, the great idea of the Republican Party is not anti-slavery. It is the honor and dignity of free labor, of hard work. And may I say, that remains the primary idea of the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Dwight David Eisenhower, George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, that's really the central idea of their political and economic ideology. The Democratic Party very much has been the party that's hostile to business. We see that even today, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who just won her primary in New York City, worked very hard to prevent Amazon from having a location which would have brought thousands of jobs to New York City, preventing that from happening. The Democratic Party has, from Jefferson to the present, been anti-business. And it is, of course, because it was rooted, that whole system was rooted in the institution of slavery. And of course, Lincoln was opposed to slavery because it reduced the dignity of hard work. Now, the other author, and I'm going to follow him more closely than Genovese, was the historian William Freeling. William Freeling, in his book, his two-volume work, The Road to Disunion, really makes an accurate portrayal of the Southern way of life prior to the Civil War, and how it changed and how it became more and more determined and obsessed with the issue of slavery. So we're going to go forward with this, and I'm going to make the case from the beginning to the end, and I'll tell you what it is, that although there were, again, many causes, I think economics plays a great part in it. I think there were blunders. I think the war was avoidable. But when you get right down to the bottom of it all, the South was fighting to defend their peculiar institution, the institution of slavery. And to understand that, we have to first understand what it was that the Southern aristocrats, slaveholding aristocrats, feared most. And first of all, they feared slave insurrections. Now, the remarkable thing is that there were very few slave insurrections in the history of the South. You read some histories of slavery, and they make it sound like slaves were always revolting. There were 3 or 4, and some of those are even of questionable historical accuracy. There's a question whether they ever really took place. The 2 that we know for sure are the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy that took place in South Carolina, and the one that I'm going to talk about now, the one that sent chills down the back of slaveholding aristocrats in the South, chills through the very bones of the slavocracy. And that was the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831. Nat Turner shook Southern slaveholders severely when he and a band of other slaves brutally murdered 60 whites in an uprising in Virginia, actually in Hampton Roads. The most frightening thing about Nat Turner for Southerners was that no one ever expected such gruesome behavior from such a well-behaved slave. The thought of slave uprisings, as I said, sent chills down the back of white slaveholders throughout the South, but especially in the Deep South, where in some places slaves outnumbered whites by 10 to 1. So Nat Turner's slave rebellion in 1831 had a chilling effect on Southern behavior. And it really is important to understand in this way. It's very important to understand. Because prior to Nat Turner's rebellion, Southerners rarely spoke positively, except for maybe in South Carolina and some of the deep South slave states. But generally, Southerners did not speak highly of the institution or positively about it. Jefferson is a typical example. At the time of the Missouri Compromise, he didn't defend the institution of slavery. He said that he trembled when he thought that God was just, but that the South predicament was like having the wolf by the ears. Southerners didn't know what to do about the institution of slavery. Another Southerner, Thomas Ritchie, in an editorial in the Richmond Inquirer during the Missouri Compromise or crisis, said, "How difficult it is for us to get rid of slavery. We do not vindicate servitude. We wish that no slave had touched our soil. We wish it could be terminated." But the South had a great deal at stake. The loss of wealth, which certainly influences people. Let me give you an example of that. George Washington came to the position during the Revolutionary War that slavery was wrong. However, Washington did not free his slaves. He watched African Americans fight alongside of white Americans against the English crown as soldiers in the Continental Army. And his opinion of Africans changed dramatically. But everything that he had ultimately was founded on the institution of slavery. So what Washington did was, before he died, he created a will in which he would emancipate his slaves at his wife Martha's death, because he didn't want his wife to be impoverished. There's the ethical and moral dilemma, which in our day and age we have a hard time understanding, but that's the way Washington saw it. But listen to what else Washington did. He endowed each of the slaves that would be freed at Martha's death with an endowment so they could learn a trade or get an education, so that they would become productive, free members of society. This was Washington's solution. Others, slave owners, were not so humane or concerned, or may I say as principled as Washington. Jefferson's slaves were sold at auction after his death because he was in debt. But he couldn't have gotten rid of his slaves because it was the only way he could run his plantation. Or I say he could have, but he would have been impoverished. Also, Southerners feared retaliation from the slave population after they were released. As I said, in some places in the South, there were 10 African slaves for every one white man. That fear ruled in their hearts. So while they, in the 1820s and in the early 1830s, tended to admit that slavery was a curse on the South. That's what George Mason said. He said he believed his country had been cursed the day that slaves landed in Virginia. But Mason was a classic Southerner. He said, I don't want Northerners interfering in our affairs. He believed it was purely a matter of the Southern states to solve. But Nat Turner's rebellion began to change. It was one of the big events that began to change that perspective by Southerners. Because the Nat Turner Rebellion had a, let's say, unexpected consequence, unintended results. Nat Turner wasn't freed. He was executed, as were those that followed him when he was rounded up. But what frightened Southerners was that in Virginia, instead of cracking down and creating a stronger police force and militia force to prevent further uprisings, the state of Virginia in the 1830s began debating the end of slavery in that state. This shocked people in South Carolina, and specifically in South Carolina, but also in other deep southern states. The deep South, they had a much stronger commitment to the institution of slavery than even in Virginia. Here is the thing about it, though. The Virginia debates on freeing their slaves shocked and surprised certain parts of the South. And such business frightened slave owners in the Deep South because it raised the possibility of isolation in the Union. What would happen if Virginia became a free state and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware followed? Well, the Deep South would be left alone in the Union. And it's extremely important. If those states, on the border states as they were called, Virginia being the most important of them, became free states and ultimately ended up with 2 senators from those free states for each one, the South would be outnumbered in the Union, and there would be the potential that someday the Constitution could be amended to eliminate slavery completely. And here is the point. Why was Virginia debating the end of slavery? Well, it was because by the 1830s, the majority of people in Virginia didn't own slaves. The major area where slavery was still dominant was the Tidewater region. The rest of Virginia, in the Piedmont and up in western Virginia, which we now call West Virginia, slaveholding was not pervasive. And non-slaveholding whites were a concern, because here is when the debates ended and Virginia voted on whether they would end slavery or not, they voted to keep slavery. Not because the vote was really democratic, but because the districts in Virginia were gerrymandered so that the slaveocracy in the Tidewater had more voice in the government and representation in the government than the majority of the population. And why that's extremely important is is that we're now talking about the age of Jackson. Remember, Thomas Jefferson believed in a natural aristocracy, but Jackson was a man of the people. And Jefferson was a child of the Enlightenment, and Jackson was a child of the Romantic era, where the ideal and the belief was that Americans, because of their confrontation with the frontier, had an intuition and a raw intelligence that allowed them to make decisions. They didn't need the natural aristocracy. The voice of the people was the voice of God. And so now the ugly head of democracy, at least in the mind of the slaveocracy of the South, had reared its head and was challenging their dominance of the Southern state governments and threatening the very foundation of their wealth and power, slavery. And the truth is that many Southern non-slaveholding whites resented the power of the aristocrats. Southern aristocrats had to find a way to control democracy, had to find a way of bringing Southern whites into the fold. They needed to find a defense for their way of life, and particularly the institution upon which it was based, the institution of slavery. And of course, there was always the danger that non-slaveholding whites would ultimately be influenced and inflamed in their passions against the slaveholding aristocracy in the South by the work of Northern abolitionists. Northern abolitionists were something new. There were anti-slavery people, but most anti-slavery people called for a gradual emancipation of slaves. In the northern states, emancipation, as far as I know, never took place immediately. The laws in the North were always created in such a way that it would literally be over a quarter of a century or a generation, 25 years or so, between the time that a law would be passed and slaves would go away. So literally in New York State, the Manumission Act that was first passed in 1799 didn't really free all the slaves till 1825. And the argument is that the slaves in that amount of time would be able to earn a trade. And secondly, on the other hand, this was a concession. This is the way they thought, that the masters had paid for the slaves. They should get their money's worth out of it. Again, that's the way they thought. Consequently, Southerners or northern states did almost, as far as I know, I think unanimously, that is the way they freed their slaves. It wasn't done immediately. Immediate emancipation didn't happen. Instead, it was gradual emancipation over a number of years. And with the idea that the slaves would be better prepared to be free and that the masters would get their money's worth. That's the way the thinking went, and that was even true in the North. But the abolitionists were very different. And it's important to note that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. The Republican Party was not an abolitionist party, although Southerners called them black abolitionists. They weren't an abolitionist party. The Republican Party very much followed the older desire to gradually end slavery in America rather than do it in one fell swoop. And some of that also had to do with constitutional scruples. Abolitionists had no constitutional scruples. William Lloyd Garrison said that the Constitution was a compact with the devil because it included the 3/5 clause. It concluded a fugitive slave clause, which required northern states to deliver up fugitive slaves when they were called on to do so by the federal government and return them to their owners. The point of the matter is the Constitution had within it mechanisms to defend the institution of slavery where it already existed. Abolitionists thought that was evil. That was a compact with the devil. Individuals like John Brown, one of the most infamous of all abolitionists, favored violence, what we would call terrorism today, to liberate the slaves. And this, of course, would chill Southerners, because in the 1850s, John Brown in Kansas took his family, his sons, and some of his friends, and they rode down the Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, where there were a number of slaveholders, and they knocked on their doors, and when they opened their doors, John Brown would take his broadsword and cleave the skulls of the slaveholders at gunpoint. So they killed all the men, and even the young teenage boys. That was the way of Northern abolitionists. They were so strongly opposed to slavery that they couldn't understand the Southern point of view at all. So, anyway, but Northern abolitionists were very zealous. Created printing presses. They actually sent their pamphlets into the South to encourage non-slaveholding Southern whites to be converted to their ideas about the abolition of slavery. So Southerners were fearful of Northern abolitionists and their influence on Southern non-slaveholding whites and on the country as a whole. Because, again, if the country becomes more free, in other words, free labor becomes the dominant form of a labor system in more states than slavery is the dominant labor system, then the likelihood that slavery will go away is greatly enhanced, and Southerners would be at a loss. Now, I want to bring in the economics on this for a moment, because it really is important to understand. There is an economic interest on the part of Southern whites, and that's why you can't really separate the two, except for the fact that tariffs and other things were ancillary to their interest in protecting slavery, and I'll come to that as we go along. Here is the point. In the South, the number one capital investment in the era before the Civil War, the number one capital investment was in slaves. At the eve of the Civil War, there were 4 million slaves. Slaves were worth anywhere between $1,000 and $2,000 in monies in the 19th century, the value of money in the 19th century. The South had approximately $4 billion invested in slavery. If emancipation took place, they would instantly lose that money, unless it was by gradual manumission. Northern abolitionists frightened them more than anyone because of their insistence that it be immediate now. Finally, Southerners feared foreign intervention. That may surprise you, but it's really important. And we'll see how it plays out here as we continue talking about this. But foreign intervention was one of the things they were very concerned about, and primarily with the most powerful country in the world, the country that the United States had fought 2 wars with. I'm talking about Great Britain. Great Britain is literally at the beginning of the century made a dramatic turn. In the 18th century, Britain was the number one country that profited from the slave trade with Africa. But in the 19th century, the government of England made a dramatic switch and became the number one anti-slavery country in the world. So that England used its vast navy to wipe out the international slave trade. That was one of the reasons they were embarrassed by the United States bringing Algiers to its knees and then followed up with their own fleet. Because others asked them, how come if you're so upset about the African slave trade, you're not doing anything about the white slave trade? And their hypocrisy was revealed by America's conduct and action and the successful campaign of Stephen Decatur and company. But the British had the power to influence slavery. And so let me just give you a point that you may not realize. If you lived in the United States prior to the Civil War and you were a slave, where would you have to go to be free? If you came to New York State, you could be apprehended, and the state of New York would have to deliver you up and send you back to Virginia or South Carolina or Kentucky, from wherever you were from. The only way you could be free is to go and follow the Underground Railroad, which many of you are aware of, and that Underground Railroad led to freedom, and that freedom was in the British Empire, in Canada, because the British would not give the runaway slaves back. Wherever the British Empire went, slavery came to an end. That's an ironic thing, isn't it? Imperial Britain is the great force for ending slavery in the world. But it's true. So, Southerners, as we shall see, were very fearful of Northern intervention, British intervention in their affairs and into the institution of slavery. And we'll see in a moment how that actually was the case. So now we're going to look at how the South defended itself, and it's how the South began to ultimately alter its perspective and its view of slavery from a quote-unquote necessary evil to a positive good. How do you combat the work of the abolitionists that might inflame Southern slaves if they could read, although most of them couldn't, but most importantly could change the minds of non-slave-holding whites in the South and encourage the North to become more zealously opposed to the institution of slavery than it was. Northerners didn't like slavery, but it was distant and far from them, so they were unlikely to become abolitionists. Southerners couldn't take that chance. So how did they defend the institution of slavery? And the first way was through apologetics. Now, apologetics isn't where we apologize for slavery. In theology, apologetics are defending the faith. So a Christian theologian would defend the doctrine of the Trinity and make the argument that although the Trinity is a paradox, it is the way that Christians express the inexpressible nature of God. It is also completely consistent, in fact necessary, to be a monotheist, to be a Trinitarian. Now that's not my point today, but that's an example of apologetics. Christians, when they engage in apologetics, don't apologize for what they believe. They defend it and explain why others should believe it. Apologetics in the South was a verbal and written defense of the institution of slavery that ultimately was crafted to present slavery as a positive good. Southerners would argue, first of all, negatively, that their labor system was superior to the Northern labor system. They contended that their slaves were treated better than Northern wage earners. In fact, they had a name for Northern wage earners. Northerners extolled the virtues of free labor. Southerners described free labor as wage slavery. Southern defenders of slavery, like, for instance, James Henry Hammond, argued that, in fact, Northern laborers were not really free. The only one who had been emancipated from their obligation, and this is very much, and we'll come to it, why they thought this, but the only ones who had been emancipated from their obligation in the North were the factory owners, the business owners, who had no obligation to take care of their slaves. Their workers. Were Northerners really free? Well, they were paid so poor, according to Southerners, where else were they going to go? If they didn't work for their employer, they would starve. So they were forced to work in the factories. But what happened if they got hurt? Or would they receive workman's compensation? Well, certainly not in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s. There was no such thing as workman's comp. Would they get unemployment insurance if they were laid off? No. The only one who benefited from the wage system in the North were the factory owners and the businessmen. This was the Southern point of view. Some historians have argued this is what you call a proto-Marxist point of view. In other words, it predicted and preceded what Marx would say later on, that capitalism is merely a way of social control over the masses of workers by promising them the right to go up the ladder, but keeping them in a position where the only ones who really take a risk are the workers. And in fairness to the South, it's true. Workers worked long hours, oftentimes weeks in a row without time off, in hazardous and dangerous positions without safety precautions, and were sometimes treated brutally, i.e., in Pennsylvania mines, young men were whipped if they didn't work hard enough. Of course, we never see any of that in our literature on the Civil War or on slavery. We're always pointed to the pictures of the African slaves who have been whipped, not the young boys in Pennsylvania factories who received a similar treatment. So in fairness to the South, there was a grain of truth. Over the last 150 years, or longer, 175 years really, the Northern wage system has become humanized. And the working conditions have been ameliorated so that by today's standards, we could look back on the situation in northern factories at the time of the Civil War and recognize the South had a point. And on the other part of their apologetics is that why the Northern wage system was the way it was is because it was a product of an inferior civilization. The Southern civilization was a more refined Christian civilization than the Northern civilization. And why that was the case was because Southerners were taught to take responsibility for each other. And here again, there is a grain of truth in what they say. It doesn't justify slavery, as they said, but there was a grain of truth. Because the masters, if they owned large plantations, couldn't fire their slaves. If the slave was injured on the job and couldn't work, the master would take care of the slave for the rest of their life. Large plantations had infirmaries to take care of the needs of the slaves. And while the Southern slave system was brutal, the reality of it is that slaves lived almost as long as whites did in the South. So their health and well-being was, in some ways, very well taken care of. Nonetheless, that doesn't justify the institution of slavery or take away the fact that on an average plantation there was at least one whipping a week. That's the part that the Southerners left out. What they argued is that the slave masters were like fathers to their slaves. That was the argument they made. And that it was about family, and family extended beyond flesh and blood to everyone who was on the plantation, and even kin outside of the plantation. So the South was a society of mutual Christian obligation, and the North society was one in which individuals were taught to be crude, rude, and greedy, and cruel, because they were taught that they had no obligations to one another at all. So, that was the Southern apologetics. Now, how successful was it? Well, it probably didn't really convince anyone but people in the South. But that was important enough, because if you convinced enough people in the South, it would benefit the slave masters, because it would ultimately continue to sustain the institution of slavery. Now, the biggest way that Southerners defended slavery was through the principles of states' rights. And the principles of states' rights is not necessarily espoused by James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson, but by John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun's ideas of states' rights were very different from Jackson's. This was especially made clear by Richard Ellis in his book, The Union at Risk, which I talked about earlier, and how he pointed out that Jackson was a majoritarian in his version of states' rights, as was Madison. But John C. Calhoun's version of states' rights was about the minority protecting itself from the majority. So it went in direct conflict with Jackson's political philosophy. But that version of states' rights was the dominant version of states' rights in the South prior to the Civil War. Fire-eating South Carolinians like John C. Calhoun pointed out that if the majority could impose their will on the minority concerning a tariff, and we're talking about the nullification crisis again, they could do it in regard to slavery. For instance, Robert Barnwell Rhett said this. He was a Southern fire-eating South Carolinian. It is not the tariff, nor yet the force bill, which constitutes the great evil. Now, we're talking about the nullification crisis. Why did South Carolina get so worked up about nullification? Now, we think it was because they were paying high tariffs, and it was hurting their economy. And that was a part of it. But listen to what Robert Barnwell Rhett says. It is not the tariff, nor yet the force bill, which constitutes the great evil, said Robert Barnwell Rhett. Your northern brethren, the whole world, are in arms against your institutions. What were they defending when they nullified the Tariff Act? They were defending slavery. Listen to what J. Hamilton Jr. said. Virginia's slavery debate, because the nullification crisis is contemporaneous with the Virginia slavery debates, and the whole issue of tariffs is a big issue at the time of the Nat Turner Rebellion. So Hamilton says, Virginia's slavery debate is nothing to what we shall see if we do not stand manfully at the safety valve of nullification. Virginia's slavery debate is nothing to what we shall see if we do not stand manfully at the safety valve of nullification. The last quote also suggests another aspect of the use of the nullification, and that is brinkmanship. Southern slaveholder extremists often work to consolidate the wayward or those whose loyalties may be suspect by pushing the envelope, so to speak, to the ultimate end to force others onto their side. And they did this in the nullification crisis. By using nullification, they pushed other Southerners into their camp because other Southern states were not happy with the idea that Jackson wanted to use force to make South Carolina abide by the laws of the United States. So here's the point. States' rights wasn't always about economics. It was about defending slavery. And I want to make this point. Southerners favored states' rights when it defended their property rights in slaves. But they weren't so enthusiastic about it when it favored or supported the northern point of view. So just as Southern slaveholders were willing to champion states' rights and nullification when it was in their interest, they were also willing to utilize federal power when it would suit the purpose of protecting slavery. And the prime example of this is the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was a part of the Compromise of 1850, and there were a number of parts of it. I refer you to your textbook. You should be very familiar with them. But the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 helped inflame passions in both the North and the South. You might remember, as I've already pointed out to you, that the Constitution of the United States required northern states to return fugitive slaves to their owners in the southern states. But it left open how that would happen. So laws had to be passed by Congress. And certain laws had been passed and they hadn't been very effective. So Southerners, as a part of the Compromise of 1850, wanted a law that would put teeth in the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution of the United States. And this law did that. In fact, it went to quite an extreme level to achieve it. This law created a category of U.S. commissioners who were empowered to issue warrants for the arrest and return of fugitive slaves. These were like U.S. Marshals. These commissioners were also authorized to deputize citizens to serve in posses to apprehend fugitive slaves. And we're talking about these posses were quite frequently in northern states where individuals didn't like slavery. By conscience, they may not be ready to become abolitionists, but by conscience, they don't want to support the slave system. Citizens, though, who refused to serve could be fined or imprisoned. Furthermore, the fugitive, whether free or not, was not allowed to testify on his own behalf. Northerners found this law extremely offensive, and some northern states passed
personal liberty laws which prevented the capture of free blacks under the law. Some states went further and guaranteed the fugitives habeas corpus and the right to trial by jury. This, my friends, is the point, is that this fugitive slave law trampled on the rights of citizens of the northern states. It took away their right to testify on their own behalf. It took away their right to their conscience. And it took away their guarantees of habeas corpus. And so these personal liberty laws were meant to restore those. Did Southerners care whether they trampled on the rights of citizens of the North? And imagine an African-American man, because I want to make this point. These commissioners got a bounty for every slave they returned. This is an age where photography isn't pervasive. The commissioner has a description of an African slave, 5'9", muscular, dark complexion, woolly hair. And the commissioner is eager to get his commission. And the African American cannot testify on his own behalf. And so the commissioner comes to, let's say, and I am making this up, I don't have an illustration right off the top of my head, but he comes to Jamestown, New York, and he finds someone who fits that description. The trouble is that gentleman has lived in New York State his entire life. He cannot testify on behalf of himself. The commissioner has every reason to apprehend him and take him back to the South. And the Southern slave owner is as happy to receive this man as he is his own slave. So a citizen of the state of New York is deprived of all his liberties without due process of law, without habeas corpus, without the ability to testify for himself. This was an egregious trampling on the rights of northern citizens. And it was one of the things that made slavery a concrete issue and not an abstract issue in the North prior to the Civil War. Most Northerners had never experienced slavery. They'd never seen it. So it was easy for them, like it is for people who are in favor of abortion, not to really think about what abortion is. It's not concrete to them. It's abstract. And they just soon keep it that way. And so it was with many Northerners, but the Fugitive Slave Act made it concrete, made it real, and it upset Northerners when they saw slavery for what it was, and it confirmed the rhetoric of the anti-slavery folks like Abraham Lincoln, who argued that there was a slaveocracy in the South that was bent on spreading their power throughout the whole Union, even if it meant destroying the liberties even of Northerners. So, this is extremely important. And probably the most important example of federal power is not the Fugitive Slave Act, but the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave. He was owned by an Army surgeon, and he had been brought into the territory north of the 3630 parallel, the Missouri Compromise, against his will by his master, and to an Army base where he stayed for many years. Dred Scott, later on, his master brought him back to Missouri, and when his master died, Dred Scott sued for his freedom, based on the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the laws that created it. that he had been taken into a free territory, and therefore he should be freed. The Missouri courts had in the past actually sided with the slaves, but because slavery was becoming such a volatile issue, the Missouri courts refused to change Dred Scott's status. However, as it turned out, he was ultimately inherited by a citizen of New York named Sanford. And so Dred Scott's lawyers sued in the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court had appellate jurisdiction to cases of appeal between citizens of one state suing citizens of another state. Dred Scott, since he claimed he was free, was a citizen of Missouri held in bondage against his will by a citizen of New York, Sanford. The Supreme Court, dominated by Southern judges. Why? Because of the Senate having equal numbers of senators from North and South, despite the North having more population, and the Electoral College allowing for the election of Southerners to the presidency or Southern sympathizing candidates to the presidency, like James Buchanan, who was president at the time of the Dred Scott case. The South dominated the federal government throughout the antebellum era. And Northerners were angered by this, and the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott is a perfect example. Controlled by Southern-leaning judges and by some what were called dough-faced judges, like a gentleman named Justice Greer from Southern Pennsylvania and a friend of James Buchanan, the court voted overwhelmingly in favor of Sanford. And they did so on two accounts. And this, of course, was the power of the Supreme Court, the federal government, imposing its will on the citizen of a state, or at least Dred Scott claimed to be. First of all, the Supreme Court declared that with the opinion of Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from the state of Maryland, a slaveholding state, that Dred Scott was not a citizen of the state of Missouri, because no black man could be the citizen of a state, of any state, because he was black. Because blacks were not citizens. They never could be. That was Taney's decision. And that was what the Supreme Court followed. Now, he could have thrown the case out after that, but Taney and company did not. They went on to declare the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because it prevented Southerners from bringing their slaves into the territories of the United States. So here is an example of federal power, two examples of federal power being used to defend the institution of slavery. So the Southerners were in favor of states' rights when it defended their point, their peculiar institution, and they were opposed to slavery when they were opposed to states' rights when it interfered with their pursuit to defend the institution of slavery. Now, Southerners also would use annexation and war. And I won't dwell on this too much, but I want to say a few words about it. The notion that somehow the Mexican-American War didn't have anything to do with slavery is really, I think, myth. The Missouri Compromise, remember, it's still in place in 1846 when the Mexican-American War begins, is still in place. And the bottom line is Southerners have no new territories to spread their institution into. Why would Southerners want to spread the institution of slavery? Well, economically, they might think it might spread. It wasn't clear that it wouldn't work. In fact, let me point out to you today that New Mexico is the largest cotton growing state in the Union. So, and some Southerners said, well, we can use it in the California mines. So Southerners were not convinced that there wasn't a place for slavery in the West, although I think that's a minority and most of them realized it wouldn't. But they were concerned about other things. What really provoked the conflict between the United States and Mexico, which we call the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, what really provoked that, you have to go back to the Texas War of Independence. Texas rebelled against Mexico. And one of the big issues in their rebellion, which we don't usually hear in American history, is Texas was a slaveholding portion of Mexico. And the Mexican government was terribly corrupt, inept, and incompetent. And there's no doubt about that. They went from one dictator to another, one coup to another. Mexico was a disaster. And I think even Mexicans would admit to that. But one thing Mexico did that America could have followed suit on was Mexico ultimately abolished slavery within its borders long before the United States did. And so when they did, the Texans who had been encouraged, and in fairness to the Texans, they'd been encouraged by the Mexican government to migrate from the United States to Texas and establish their plantations there, their system of slavery before this, immediately revolted. And without going into great detail, they won their independence. Mexico never really accepted it. In fact, Mexico never acknowledged the existence of the Texas Republic, of the Lone Star Republic. And so Texas was always in a precarious place because Mexico was much bigger than Texas. And the possibility that Mexico, when it finally got some stability, would turn and invade Texas and restore it as their territory alarmed the Texans. And in the 1830s, they worked very hard to try to convince Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren to go to Congress and try to annex Texas through a treaty between Texas and the United States. But Jackson didn't want a war with Mexico, and he realized that's where it would go. And Van Buren likewise. So neither were really interested in following up with Texas's plea for the United States to annex it. It wasn't until the first Whig president, William Henry Harrison, died in office that Texas's pleas were listened to and given some credence by the United States government. William Henry Harrison was from the North. He was from the Midwest, and he was a Whig. His running mate, as a means of unifying the ticket and the party, was from the state of Virginia. His name was John Tyler. William Henry Harrison only lived a month, and John Tyler became president. And John Tyler wanted to become president for a second term. So he latched onto the idea of annexing Texas. And he worked very hard at it. And again, I won't go into the details of it, but in the end, with the help of his Secretary of State, John C. Calhoun, he succeeded in doing so. He did it because not by a treaty, but by a joint resolution of Congress, which was of questionable legality. But Britain provoked a crisis. Yes, Britain. Remember I said that one of the things that the Southern slaveholding aristocracy were fearful of was Britain's power. And when the United States had refused to annex or ignored Texas's pleas to be annexed by the United States, the British became a suitor for the Yellow Rose of Texas. Britain offered to make Texas a protectorate, which would mean it would be in the British Empire, but it would run its own affairs, but the British would have a right to possibly have a naval base there, which would mean the British would have a naval base in the Gulf of Mexico, something the United States did not want to see happen. But from the Southern point of view, a far more dangerous possibility is that Britain would encourage Texas to give up its slaves, because Britain was just eager to do that. And in fact, that's what the British did. They offered the Texans a compensation for their slaves so that the Texans would emancipate their slaves and Texas would be a slave-free zone. And in turn, the British would protect Texas and would use its power. Remember, Britain is the most powerful country in the world, to force Mexico to acknowledge Texas's independence. Now, I want you to understand why this is so important to Southerners and to James K. Polk, who followed John Tyler in office. Why it's so important is slaves wouldn't have to run to Canada. They could cross the border from Louisiana into Texas. The slaves in Arkansas, the slaves in Louisiana, the slaves in Tennessee, the slaves in Mississippi wouldn't have very far to go. And once they were in Texas, they would be free and would not have to be delivered. It would be much better for the slaveholders if Texas was a part of the United States. But of course, if Texas became a part of the United States, that would provoke Texas, or that would provoke Mexico into a war with the United States. And that's exactly what happened. Polk found himself in a position where Mexico claimed the border with Texas was the Nueces River, and the Texans claimed their border with Mexico was the Rio Grande. Thousands of square miles of territory would be lost if it wasn't the Rio Grande. And it would be a violation of their agreement with Texas. So Polk sent troops into the region between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, and so did the Mexican government, and the Mexicans fired on the Americans there, and that was considered by Polk an act of war. So we invaded Mexico, and when Mexico refused to surrender under American terms, and we finally forced them to, as I've shared before, the United States not only took Texas and the territory above the Rio Grande, we took California, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and of course Texas itself. And I'm probably leaving something out, but mostly the biggie was California. All of that territory became American. We paid them for it, and that's fair to note. But now, if you're a Southerner, what you see is the opportunity for westward expansion. This becomes the issue of the day. And Southerners want to expand into those territories. A obscure congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot attached a proviso to an appropriations bill to pay for the equipment and weapons and supplies to sustain the war against Mexico.
And his proviso said, essentially, that none of the territory taken from Mexico in the war would be slave territory. In other words, slavery would be prohibited from any of the territories taken from Mexico. It didn't pass, but it became the battle cry of the 1850s. And that's why westward expansion is one of the ways that Southerners defend the institution of slavery. How do they do it? They do it in this way. They don't dare back away. It goes along with the argument of apologetics. If Southerners agree that slavery will not go into the territories, they will be admitting to non-slaveholding whites that the abolitionists are right, and their position is morally inferior to the abolitionists. And so they have to fight all the harder to spread slavery. And secondly, for every slave state that's in the Union, they maintain 2 senators. Some Southerners salivated with the thought of dividing Texas into 5 states and getting 10 different senators. That would give them a numerical superiority. And this is really the root. This is the end of the sort of peace between the North and South created by the Compromise of 1850. And it opens the door for the crisis that begins in the 1850s over the institution of slavery. Southerners, for the reasons I've given, could not do anything but defend the right of the South to expand into the territories of the United States. And that meant saying, and they succeeded in this as well, that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. 2 last points, and that is that the South would use, Southern aristocracy would use Herrenvolk democracy. Certainly these Southern aristocrats were really committed to a natural aristocracy. They believed themselves to be that natural aristocracy. But they used democracy as a means of social control. It's the way they maintained their control over non-slaveholding whites. Herrenvolk democracy is the democracy of the master class. And so Southerners began to espouse, Southern slave owners began to espouse a democracy of the master class. What makes you equal with wealthy slave-owning aristocrats in the South? It's that you're white and you're not black. It's that you're free and you're not a slave. But if the slaves become free, you will be equal with them, a mere laborer. So to maintain your superiority over the black slave population, you must support our position of keeping the slaves in their place. James McPherson argues, and I think convincingly so, that this is the way that Southerners managed their population. It's why, when the vast majority of Southerners didn't own slaves, you would have such support for the Confederacy from day one. Lincoln and company didn't get that, as you will see in my next lecture. But Southerners found a way to bring the vast majority of non-slaving holding whites on board. And it's also why they couldn't afford to stay in the Union when Lincoln won, because it would be also admitting that they were in the moral wrong. So they ultimately were determined that that couldn't happen. And the last thing they did, and this is extremely important to know, their last defense of slavery was secession and civil war. It wasn't inevitable that secession would lead to civil war, but Lincoln, considering his belief in the indestructible nature or indivisible nature of the Union, that the Constitution created a perpetual, indestructible Union, and that no state had a right to secede, it would
almost be unavoidable for a war to take place. And consequently, but Southerners were not opposed to that for a number of reasons, and we shall see that in the Deep South, they wanted the war because they recognized that unless they had the war, they would be completely overwhelmed in terms of force and military power by the North. They had to find a way to encourage the border states like Virginia and Kentucky and North Carolina, although you wouldn't think of North Carolina as a border state, and even Tennessee to join the Union, because those states didn't immediately join the Confederacy. They were on the fence. But why did the South secede when it did? Here is the answer, because that's an important question. It's because they knew the jig was up. With Lincoln as president and the reality that slavery was not going to spread into the territories of the United States, the only way they could defend slavery where it was at was to leave the Union and establish constitutions that would uphold slavery as a permanent, fixed part of the South's culture, civilization, and political frame. And so secession became essential. But it was also essential that as many of the southern states that were slaveholding states would join the Confederacy. Later, Jefferson Davis would say that they were only defending their own territory. They had no territorial ambitions. But the record shows otherwise. States like Maryland did not secede. Kentucky did not secede. Kentucky remained neutral, they said. And Lincoln respected that neutrality. And southern armies invaded New Mexico to try to make it into a southern state. They invaded Maryland, and Southerners invaded Kentucky while the North remained respectful of Kentucky's sovereignty. Because the South realized that at any time the North wanted to invade the South, unless they gathered all of the slave states under their fold, they would fail. The North would overwhelm them. They needed Virginia. They needed Kentucky. They needed Missouri. They needed Tennessee. And what better way to achieve that goal than to force a crisis, an incident? And they did so when Lincoln tried to send supplies, not military reinforcements, but supplies to Fort Sumter. And the South Carolina, which was the real central, the first state to secede from the Union, provoked the crisis and forced Lincoln's hand by firing on Fort Sumter and forcing it to surrender. By doing that, they placed Virginia in the position of having to decide, Tennessee and North Carolina in a position of having to decide, because they forced Lincoln's hand. If Lincoln was to uphold his oath, he would have to raise an army and invade South Carolina and reimpose Union law in that wayward state. That offended Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and they immediately joined the Confederacy, which dramatically increased the power and the ability of the Confederacy to sustain itself. Here's the really important point. 1/8 of all of the Confederacy's manufacturing capacity was in Virginia. 1/8 of its rail didn't run through Virginia, but ultimately ended up in Richmond. Without Virginia, the Confederacy was doomed. but by provoking an incident at Charleston and forcing Lincoln to play his hand, they ensured that Virginia would join the Confederacy. And Virginia gets to the point that this is still multi-causal. Because although the other states joined, Virginia does it more about their sensitivity about states' rights. In the end, guys like Robert E. Lee weren't really as defenders of slavery. Robert E. Lee was still someone who felt like he had the wolf by the ears. He was one who recognized slavery as an evil, but he didn't quite know what to do with it. However, he was a believer in states' rights and believed that Virginia was his country, and so he followed Virginia's lead, left the Union Army, and ultimately would become the greatest general in the Confederacy and possibly in American history. But the point is, South Carolina practiced brinkmanship as they'd had in the nullification crisis, only this time it was to provoke a civil war and ensure that the South was solid. Kentucky, Maryland, because Lincoln prevented Maryland from joining, Kentucky and Missouri did not join. Kentucky was neutral. Missouri had its own little civil war, which the North ultimately won and prevented Missouri from seceding. Kentucky joined the Union. That's why it's funny when you see Kentuckians waving Confederate flags, because they were a part of the Union during the war. They just may not know it. Okay. So, what's the conclusion? Simple. When push came to shove, what did the South do? It protected the institution of slavery, and that trumped all other principles and concerns. It doesn't mean that the South wasn't more committed to states' rights than the North. It doesn't mean that there weren't economic concerns in the South. Certainly, you can't really separate the institution of slavery from that because, as I said, the South would be impoverished. And in fact, they were when slavery was abolished, because when the 13th Amendment was ratified, which really is the end of slavery, not June 19th, that meant that the South instantaneously lost $4 billion in capital. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Have a nice day.